Okay, so this one's going to be a lot of writing. Hopefully, my handwriting is legible by the end, but please make sure you're listening because I will be saying the words correctly. And there's examples for each one, so make sure you jot those down. So we're going to be putting examples down here. So hopefully a lot of this is review, and it's going to be a lot of repetitive words. So the commutative property of addition is when you change the order of the numbers that you're adding, but it doesn't actually change the sum. So when we change the order, change the order. So when we change the order of the addends, aka the numbers added together, okay, so when we change the order of the addends, but the sum does not change. Okay, and what that looks like is just simply when we go from 3 plus 5 and we make it 5 plus 3. So we're flipping the order from 3 to 5 to 5 plus 3, but they're both still equal to 8. And that's the commutative property of addition. Okay, the associative property of addition is when we change the grouping. So when we change the grouping, of the addends. But that also does not change the sum. So the sum does not change. And what that looks like is when we have something like in parentheses 3 plus 4, and then we have a plus 5 outside. When we change that to be 5 plus 4 plus 3. So we're changing the grouping. But the sum will still be 7 plus 5 or 9 plus 3, which is still 12. Okay. So now the identity property, or the identity property of 0. Okay. So identity property or the addition property of 0 is simply when we add any number and 0 together. So it's saying the sum of any number and 0 is that number. So that's a fancy way of saying when you add 0 to something, it stays the same. So if we did 9 plus 0, it's still going to be 9, right? So it's just a fancy way to say that. So that's the identity property of 0 or the addition property of 0. All right, so let's talk about multiplication now. So multiplication, still have commutative, associative, and identity, but we'll have 2 more thrown in at the end. So commutative is the same thing, but instead of changing the numbers that we add together, we're just changing the order of the numbers multiplied. So commutative is changing the order of factors. It does not change the product. Okay, so commutative order, associative grouping. Okay, so that's going to be important to remember. So an example here is going to be if we have 3 times 5, that's 15. That's going to be the same thing as if we do 5 times 3, which is also 15. So we're just changing the order of the numbers. Whereas associative is when we change the grouping of the numbers. So we change the grouping of the factors. That also does not change the product. Okay, so commutative, we change the order. So that might be helpful to underline. So commutative, we change the order. Associative, we change the grouping. Okay, and that's the same on both addition and multiplication. So let's throw an example up here of the associative. That's 3 times 4 times 5 is the same thing as 3 times in parentheses 4 times 5. So we're just changing the grouping. It's still 60 on either side. Okay. So now the identity property or the multiplication property of 1 is really easy, or not an easy way, a confusing way to say a number times 1 just gives me that number. So a number times 1 equals that number. So that's what the identity property is, but we'll put it into harder or fancier terms, which says the product of any number and 1 so the product of any number and 1 is that number. That's exactly what I said down here, in that 4 times 1 gives you itself, or gives you 4. So a number times 1 is that number. The multiplication property of 0, that is similar, whereas a number times 0 is going to be 0. So if we did 4 times 0 in this case, it's going to give us 4. I lied. It's going to give us 0. Whew. Sorry. A number times 0 is always going to be 0. So the product of any number and 0 is 0. So any number, when you multiply it times 0, it's always going to give you 0. And that's the multiplication property of 0. Okay. And then distributive property. This one's a little harder sometimes, and this one's the most words, so please bear with me with my writing. I'm going to try my best. Okay, so the distributive property is when you multiply a sum or a difference. So multiply a sum or difference by a number. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a moment. So that's like saying if we have 2, and then in parentheses we have 4 plus 3. And so that's what we're talking about when we multiply a sum or difference by a different number. Okay, and what we do there is we then multiply each number in the sum or difference. I'm just going to write in parentheses. So multiply each number in parentheses by the number outside. Outside the parentheses. So what that looks like is we're going to take this 2 and we're multiplying both of these numbers in the parenthesis by that number. So that would really look like now 2 times 4. We keep that plus sign, plus now 2 times 3. Okay, and we do that for plus or minus. The only thing that changes is that now it's 2 times 4 minus 2 times 3. So the numbers and the distributive property works the same way now. We also do that with variables. So you might see it as 8x plus y. And that just becomes, we still distribute the 8 to both. So that becomes 8x plus 8y. Okay, and we're going to get to variables and stuff in the next unit, so don't stress too much about that. Okay, so that's the properties. I'm not expecting you to know each one word for word, but you will have to understand the concept. Commutative, you change the order. Associative, you change the grouping. Identity properties, the numbers become the same. The multiplicative property just says number times 0 is 0. Distributive is perhaps the most confusing, but it's the one you will see and use the most. Okay.